Jonathan Whitmore was 24 years old when his father told him he was no longer welcome at the family table. It was a Sunday afternoon in October. The dining room smelled like polished wood and expensive candles, the way it always had in the house Jonathan grew up in. His mother, Eleanor, sat perfectly still at the far end of the table, her hands folded, her eyes fixed somewhere past her son's shoulder, refusing to meet his gaze. "You will not marry that girl," his father, Richard Whitmore, said. "Not while you carry this family's name." The girl was Maria Delgado, a nurse, the daughter of a man who had once worked in a warehouse and later, briefly, run a small auto parts shop that had failed within 2 years. To Richard Whitmore, founder and chairman of Whitmore Industrial Holdings, this made Maria unsuitable in a way he never fully explained, only insisted upon, the way wealthy men of his generation often insisted upon things without feeling any need to justify them. Jonathan had expected disapproval. He had not expected what came next. "If you marry her," Richard said, "you will no longer be my son. Not in this house, not in this family, not in my will." Jonathan looked at his mother, waiting for her to say something, anything in his defense. She said nothing. She only reached for her water glass and drank from it slowly, as though the conversation happening 3 feet away from her belonged to someone else's family entirely. His older sister, Vanessa, sat beside their father, her expression carefully neutral, the way it always was during family conflicts, a practiced blankness she had perfected over years of being the child their parents approved of. Vanessa was 27, already married to Edmund Cross, the son of their father's oldest business partner, a marriage that had been quietly arranged, though no one in the family ever used that word out loud, over the course of nearly a decade of family dinners and business functions designed to bring the two of them into each other's orbit. Jonathan married Maria 6 months later, in a small courthouse ceremony attended by 12 people, none of them named Whitmore. The morning of the wedding, Jonathan stood in the small apartment he had rented weeks earlier, adjusting his borrowed suit in a mirror that didn't quite hang straight, and felt, for the first time in his adult life, a strange mixture of grief and relief so tightly intertwined he couldn't separate them. He had spent 24 years learning to read his father's moods, to anticipate his mother's silences, to compete quietly with Vanessa for approval that always seemed to land just slightly out of his reach. That morning, dressing alone, he understood that all of it was finally, irreversibly behind him. Maria's mother, a warm, exhausted woman named Carmen who worked long shifts at a school cafeteria, cried through the entire ceremony, not out of sadness, but out of the particular joy of watching her daughter marry a man who looked at her. Carmen told Jonathan afterward, the way her own husband had once looked at her, before decades of financial strain had worn some of that softness down to something quieter and more practical. Alberto Delgado, Maria's father, gave a short, unpolished toast at the small reception that followed, held in the backyard of the Delgado family home, with folding tables and store-bought flowers and a homemade cake that Carmen had stayed up 2 nights baking herself. "I don't know much about the world you came from, son," Alberto said, raising a glass of inexpensive wine toward Jonathan, "but I know what it looks like when a man loves someone honestly, without needing anything from her family's name or her father's business to make it real. That's the only inheritance that ever actually mattered in this family, and you already have it." He was cut off completely. No inheritance, no family gatherings, no phone calls on his birthday. His father made good on every word of his threat, with the cold, methodical thoroughness of a man who had built an empire out of never once going back on a decision once it was made. For the first several years, Jonathan and Maria built a life from almost nothing. He had a business degree and no experience running anything without his father's name attached to it. She had her nursing salary and an unshakable, quiet determination that Jonathan came to understand, over those difficult years, was the very quality his father had never bothered to look for in her. They lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat for the first 4 years of their marriage, the hum of industrial dryers audible through the floorboards most evenings, a sound Jonathan eventually found strangely comforting, a reminder of the life he was building with his own hands rather than one handed to him. There were difficult nights during those early years, nights when Jonathan lay awake calculating whether their combined income would stretch far enough to cover both rent and Maria's nursing school loans, nights when the temptation to simply call his father, apologize, agree to whatever conditions might restore his place in the family, pressed uncomfortably close. He never made that call. "I don't want you to resent me someday for what this cost you," Maria told him once, during one particularly difficult winter when their apartment's heating system had failed and neither of them could afford the repair for several weeks. "If you need to go back to them, I would understand." By the time their first child, a daughter named Isabel, was born, Jonathan had been promoted twice at the logistics firm where he had taken his first job. By the time their second child, a son named Miguel, was born, he had left the logistics firm to start his own small consulting practice. Maria's parents, unlike Jonathan's, embraced the marriage completely. Alberto Delgado treated Jonathan like a son from the very first dinner, teaching him things his own father never had: how to fix a leaking faucet, how to change a car's oil, how to sit quietly with another person without needing to fill the silence with anything at all. It was Alberto who first noticed something strange, nearly 15 years into the marriage. He had kept in an old cigar box a photograph from decades earlier showing a much younger Richard Whitmore standing beside a man Alberto identified as his own former business partner. "We had a small parts distribution company together," Alberto explained. "Your father was one of our biggest clients. Then everything fell apart. My partner said your father had underbid us on purpose, using information he shouldn't have had. The company folded within a year," Jonathan asked his father directly. Richard Whitmore denied any memory of it and hung up the phone. 20 years passed. Jonathan's consulting practice grew into a respected firm. Isabel was accepted into a competitive engineering program. Miguel developed a passion for restoring old cars with his grandfather Alberto. Vanessa, meanwhile, sat on the board of Whitmore Industrial Holdings alongside her husband Edmund, hosting charity galas at the same house Jonathan had grown up in. Richard Whitmore died on a Tuesday morning of a sudden heart attack at 78. He had never once reached out to Jonathan, never met his grandchildren. The will was read 3 days after the funeral. As expected, the estate passed to Vanessa. Jonathan received nothing. What no one expected was a second envelope, marked to be opened only in the presence of both children. Inside was a letter, along with a decades-old contract bearing the name of Alberto Delgado's former business partner. "If you are reading this, I am gone," the letter began, "and I no longer have the option of continuing to avoid what I am about to tell you." Richard Whitmore's letter described how, facing a cash crisis decades earlier, he had used stolen bidding information to destroy a small partnership run by 2 men, one of them Alberto Delgado. The partnership collapsed. Alberto's partner lost everything and 18 months later took his own life. "My son fell in love with the daughter of the very man whose business I destroyed," the letter continued. "I could not bear the possibility of her father recognizing what I had done. I sacrificed my own son's place in this family to keep that truth buried." The room was silent. Vanessa whispered, "This isn't true. He wouldn't have done that." Fenwick produced documentation corroborating every detail. Jonathan sat very still. He had spent 20 years believing his father's rejection was about class. Instead, it had been about a buried crime and a man's death. Vanessa left in visible shock and did not speak to Jonathan for nearly 3 weeks. Jonathan reached out to the surviving family of Alberto's former partner and found a granddaughter named Emma, who had grown up hearing only fragments of what happened. "I'm not doing this to protect my father's memory," Jonathan told her. "I'm doing it because your grandfather's family deserved this truth decades ago." Vanessa, once her shock gave way to reckoning, took the lead on a restitution effort. The company established a private fund. Alberto received a formal acknowledgement, along with a personal visit from Vanessa. "I owe you an apology I can't fully give on my father's behalf," she told him. Alberto simply said, "Thank you for coming yourself. That matters more than the money." The relationship between Jonathan and Vanessa did not repair itself easily, but something did begin, slowly. Vanessa attended Isabel's college graduation and met Miguel properly for the first time in his garage. Vanessa's own reckoning unfolded painfully. She had spent her whole identity believing herself the child who had done everything correctly. Edmund, her husband, reacted with clinical detachment, worried only about reputational risk. "I spent my whole life being praised for making the safe, correct decision," she told Jonathan. "I'm starting to understand that the safe decision and the right decision were never the same thing in this family." Her marriage to Edmund did not survive. They separated amicably, and Vanessa began building an independent identity in her 50s. Jonathan visited his mother Alina alone and asked whether she had known anything before the letter surfaced. "I knew there had been trouble," she admitted. "I never asked for details. Your father made it clear certain things were not meant to be examined too closely. Do you regret that?" Jonathan asked. "Every day," she said quietly. "I let that fear cost me a relationship with my own son for 20 years. Alina began a slow, clumsy process of building a relationship with her grandchildren. She visited Miguel's garage in a cardigan and pearls, asking careful questions about the old convertible he and Alberto had restored. "Your grandfather Alberto taught me almost everything I know," Miguel told her. "I'm glad you had him," Alina said. "I'm sorry it couldn't have been both of us." Maria's father, Alberto, died peacefully 18 months after receiving the Whitmore family's acknowledgement. News of the restitution eventually became public. Some readers focused on the tragedy of the suicide decades earlier. Others debated how much blame belonged to Richard Whitmore alone, and how much to an entire social class built on appearances over honesty. Isabel called her father the evening the article appeared. "I always wondered why you never seemed angry about any of it," she said. "I decided, fairly early on, that I wasn't willing to spend my life waiting for someone else's approval to feel like my life mattered," Jonathan told her. Miguel, hearing this, spent a weekend in his garage. "I keep thinking about how close I came to never existing in the world I actually got to grow up in," he told his father. At Alberto's funeral, Vanessa attended without being asked. Afterward, she found Jonathan in the churchyard. "I used to think I got the better deal, growing up," she told him. "I understand now that you got something I never had. A family that never needed a secret to survive." Jonathan simply put his arm around his sister. Years later, Jonathan asked the family attorney, Fenwick, whether his father had been a good man underneath it all. "I think he was a frightened man who mistook control for safety, and safety for love," Fenwick said. Jonathan never reached a fully satisfying answer. What he found instead was a workable peace, the understanding that some questions about the people who raise us are never meant to resolve into anything as clean as forgiveness or condemnation. Isabel, now engaged to be married herself, told her father she intends to build her own marriage on complete honesty rather than family name or fortune. At the engagement dinner, Alina sat at the same table as Alberto's widow, Carmen. "I used to imagine families like yours must have envied what we had," Alina admitted to Carmen. "I understand now how wrong I was about almost everything that actually mattered." Carmen took Alina's hand. "Family isn't a thing you either have or don't have," she said. "It's something you keep choosing, every single day." Miguel began building an old friendship with one of Vanessa's children, a cousin he had barely known growing up. The truth Richard Whitmore spent 30 years hiding did not destroy his family, as he had always feared it would. It simply revealed how much of that family had already quietly been broken long before the truth ever had the chance to reach it. Families are not destroyed in a single moment. They are worn down slowly over years, by every small silence chosen instead of an honest conversation. What the truth did, when it finally arrived, was not destruction. It was simply light, arriving very late into rooms that had been dark for far longer than anyone in that family had ever been willing to admit. What would it cost you, right now today, to tell the people closest to you the truth you have been most carefully protecting them from. And what might it cost them later if you keep protecting them from it instead? Jonathan Whitmore was 24 years old when his father taught him that, in the Whitmore family, love had always come with conditions. The Whitmore estate overlooked the Hudson River like a palace built to remind the world who held the power. Every polished marble floor, every priceless painting, every crystal chandelier reflected Richard Whitmore's obsession with perfection. To outsiders, the Whitmores represented success, discipline, and prestige. To Jonathan, the mansion had never truly felt like home. It felt like a place where mistakes were remembered forever, and love had to be earned. On that Sunday evening, the dining room looked exactly as it had every week for as long as Jonathan could remember. The silverware was perfectly aligned. The crystal glasses sparkled beneath the chandelier. Every servant quietly disappeared after serving dinner, leaving only the four members of the Whitmore family. Richard Whitmore sat at the head of the table. Jonathan sat across from him. His mother, Eleanor, barely touched her food. His older sister, Vanessa, sensed something was wrong long before anyone spoke. Richard calmly folded his napkin and placed it beside his plate. "Heard you've been spending a great deal of time with Maria Delgado." Jonathan didn't hesitate. "I have." Richard nodded slowly. "And I'm going to marry her." Room fell silent. Even the ticking of the grandfather clock seemed louder. Richard stared at his son for several long seconds. "I hope the rumors weren't true." "They are. You understand exactly who her family is." "I do, the daughter of Alberto Delgado." "Yes." Richard's voice became colder. "Then this conversation is over." Jonathan remained calm. "It hasn't even begun." "I love her." Richard slowly stood. "Love has ruined more men than failure ever has." Jonathan looked directly into his father's eyes. "No, greed has." Vanessa lifted her head in shock. Jonathan had never challenged their father before. Richard's expression darkened. "Forgotten who you are. Finally know who I am." Richard walked toward the window overlooking the river. "For generations, this family has built a legacy. You're willing to throw it away. For a nurse." Jonathan rose from his chair. "I'm willing to walk away from money. I'm not walking away from the woman I love." Richard turned around. "You think this is about money? What else could it be?" For the first time, fear flashed across Richard's face. It disappeared almost immediately. "It's about protecting this family." "What?" Richard remained silent. Jonathan suddenly understood. "It isn't Maria you're afraid of. It's her last name." Again, silence. That silence answered every question. Jonathan slowly removed the Whitmore family signet ring from his finger. His grandfather had worn it. His father had worn it. One day it was supposed to become his. He placed it carefully on the table. The sound echoed through the enormous dining room. "If wearing this ring means becoming the kind of man who abandons the people he loves." He looked directly at Richard. "Then I don't deserve it." Richard's voice became ice. "If you marry Maria Delgado, you are no longer my son." Eleanor gasped. "Richard, please." "Enough." A tear rolled down her face. Vanessa wanted to speak. She couldn't. Years of fearing her father had stolen her voice. Jonathan looked around the room where every childhood memory had been made. "I spent my entire life trying to make you proud." His voice remained steady. "But I finally understand something. Never wanted a son. You wanted someone who would never question you." Richard said nothing. Jonathan picked up his coat. As he reached the front door, Richard spoke one final time. "If you leave this house, never come back." Jonathan stopped. He never turned around. "I won't." He walked out without another word. Outside, Maria waited beside her old blue sedan. The moment she saw his face, she knew exactly what had happened. He chose the company. Jonathan slowly shook his head. "No," chose fear. Maria wrapped her arms around him. "So sorry." Jonathan held her tightly. "The first time in my life. I don't have to pretend to be someone I'm not." 6 months later, they were married inside a small courthouse. There were no reporters, no politicians, no billionaires, only 12 people who truly loved them. After the ceremony, Alberto Delgado embraced Jonathan. "I can't give you a fortune," he said with a warm smile, "but you'll never have to wonder whether you're loved." Jonathan smiled through tears. "That's worth more than everything my father owns." Far across the city, Richard Whitmore sat alone in his study. A servant quietly informed him that Jonathan had married. Richard dismissed everyone from the room. Only after the door closed did he unlock the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside rested an old photograph. Three young men stood beside a delivery truck, smiling as though the future belonged to them. Richard Whitmore, Alberto Delgado, Samuel Carter. Richard gently brushed the dust from the picture. His hands began to tremble. "I had no choice," he whispered, but deep inside, he knew that was the greatest lie he had ever told, because long before he lost his son, he had already destroyed another man's life, and the truth he had buried for nearly 30 years was finally beginning to surface. The first year of marriage tested Jonathan and Maria in ways neither of them had imagined. The apartment they rented was barely 600 square feet, tucked above an aging laundromat on the edge of the city. Every morning they woke to the rumble of industrial washing machines below them. In winter the windows leaked cold air. In summer the tiny rooms trapped the heat. But every evening when Jonathan opened the apartment door, Maria greeted him with the same smile. "Welcome home." Those two words slowly became more valuable than every luxury he had left behind. Finding work proved harder than Jonathan expected. His education impressed employers. His last name frightened them. Some recognized him immediately. Others quietly made phone calls after the interview. Several companies offered him positions before suddenly withdrawing them the following day. No one explained why. No one had to. Richard Whitmore's influence reached farther than Jonathan had ever realized. After months of searching, Jonathan accepted an entry-level position at a small logistics company owned by an elderly businessman named Harold Bennett. Harold never asked about Jonathan's family. He cared only about one thing. "Can you solve problems?" Jonathan answered honestly. "Work until I do," Harold smiled. "Then you start Monday." Salary barely covered rent. Some months Jonathan and Maria carefully counted every dollar before going to the grocery store. One evening Jonathan apologized after placing a simple dinner on the table. "I'm sorry, this is all I can give you." Maria looked at the homemade soup and fresh bread she had baked herself. She smiled. "When I was little, my father used to say something." Jonathan looked up. "What? If a family can still laugh while eating simple food, they're already richer than most millionaires." Jonathan couldn't help smiling. "Sound just like him." "I hope so." Months passed. Jonathan worked harder than anyone else in the company. He arrived before sunrise. He stayed after everyone else had gone home. He never complained. He never asked for favors. One rainy evening Harold found Jonathan reorganizing the warehouse alone. "You know you're not paid for overtime." Jonathan nodded. "I know." "Then why are you still here?" Jonathan looked around the warehouse. "Because if someone trusts me with their business, I want them to know they made the right decision." Harold studied him for several seconds. The next morning Jonathan received his first promotion. The raise wasn't large, but Jonathan held the letter in his hands as though it were priceless. That night he rushed home carrying a small chocolate cake. Maria laughed the moment she saw it. "We're celebrating." "We certainly are." "What happened?" "I earned it." "Inherited, not gifted, earned." Maria threw her arms around him. "I knew you would." Celebrated with takeout burgers, a $5 bottle of sparkling cider, and one tiny candle placed on top of the cake. It was one of the happiest nights of Jonathan's life. Neither of them noticed the black sedan parked across the street. Inside sat Richard Whitmore. For nearly an hour he watched through the windshield. He saw Jonathan laughing. He saw Maria kiss her husband after he blew out the candle. He saw two people who had almost nothing, yet somehow possessed everything money had failed to buy. Charles Fenwick, Richard's longtime attorney, quietly broke the silence. "You could still walk across the street." Richard never looked away. "Don't deserve to," Charles frowned. "Then why come here?" Richard's voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I wanted to see whether my son was happy." And Richard watched Jonathan wrap his arm around Maria as they laughed together. "He is." Charles looked at him. "Isn't that what every father wants?" Painful smile crossed Richard's face. "It should have been." Charles hesitated. "Then why did you send him away?" Richard gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "Because the day Jonathan introduced me to Maria Delgado, I realized my past had finally come back for me." He closed his eyes. "And I was too much of a coward to face it." 5 years passed. Jonathan never became rich overnight. He simply refused to give up. While others rushed home after work, he stayed late learning every part of the business. He studied contracts, transportation routes, warehouse operations, and customer service. Harold Bennett noticed something unusual about the young man. Jonathan never worked as if he were trying to impress his boss. He worked as if he were trying to become someone he could be proud of. One afternoon, Harold called him into his office. "Owned this company for 34 years, the old man said. Hired hundreds of people." He slid a folder across the desk. "But I've never trusted anyone as quickly as I've trusted you." Jonathan opened it. Inside was an offer to become operations manager. His salary would nearly double. Jonathan looked up in disbelief. "Are you sure?" Harold smiled. "I don't reward talent. I reward character." For a moment Jonathan couldn't speak. He thought about the mansion he had left behind, the private schools, the luxury cars, the expensive suits. None of those things had earned him this promotion. His character had. That evening he ran home with the letter in his hand. Maria read it twice before throwing her arms around him. "I told you. You were never meant to live in your father's shadow." A year later, their first child was born. Jonathan held his newborn daughter against his chest while tears filled his eyes. "What should we call her?" the nurse asked. Jonathan looked at Maria. She smiled. "Isabel." Jonathan kissed his daughter's forehead. "Promise you something. You will never have to earn my love." 3 years later, their son Miguel was born. Life was still far from perfect. The apartment remained small. Money was carefully budgeted every month. But the home was filled with laughter. On weekends, Jonathan built toy castles from cardboard boxes. Maria danced with the children while music played from an old radio in the kitchen. They had little, yet they felt incredibly wealthy. Across the city, Richard Whitmore quietly followed every milestone. Private investigators reported when Isabel started school, when Miguel learned to ride a bicycle, when Jonathan received another promotion. Richard kept every report locked inside the same drawer that held the old photograph. He celebrated none of those moments. He simply watched from a distance. Every year the distance became harder to bear. One Saturday afternoon, Jonathan drove the children to Alberto Delgado's repair shop. Miguel loved watching engines being repaired. Isabel enjoyed listening to her grandfather's stories. While the children played outside, Alberto invited Jonathan into the back office. "Been meaning to show you something." He opened an old wooden box that looked older than both of them. Inside were faded photographs, receipts, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes. Alberto carefully removed one photograph. 3 young men stood shoulder to shoulder beside a delivery truck. They couldn't have been older than 25. Jonathan immediately recognized one of them, Richard Whitmore. The second was Alberto himself. But it was the third face Jonathan had never seen. "Who's he?" Alberto stared at the photograph. "Samuel Carter, my best friend. Built our first company together." Jonathan studied the smiling faces. "They all look happy." Alberto answered quietly. "We believed we'd grow old together." Happened. Alberto slowly sat down. "We spent 2 years preparing a bid for the biggest contract of our lives. If we won, our families would never struggle again." Jonathan listened carefully. "We lost. Less than 1%. He looked back at Richard's young face in the photograph. "The winning company belonged to your father." Jonathan frowned. "That's possible." "No," replied softly. "Strange part came later." "What do you mean?" "Richard's bid matched ours almost perfectly. So perfectly that Samuel became convinced someone had stolen our confidential numbers." Jonathan felt a chill. "Did you ever prove it?" Alberto slowly shook his head. "No, we searched, asked questions. We never found evidence." He lowered his eyes. "Without that contract, our company collapsed. Banks took everything. Employees lost their jobs. Samuel," his voice cracked, "lost hope." Jonathan remained silent. 18 months later, Samuel Carter took his own life. The words hung in the room. Jonathan looked once more at the smiling young men in the photograph. One had built an empire. One spent his life repairing cars. One never lived long enough to see his daughter grow up. Suddenly, his father's fear finally began to make sense. But Jonathan still didn't know the truth, only that somewhere in the past, Richard Whitmore had buried a secret powerful enough to destroy every life connected to it. Jonathan couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. That night, after Maria and the children had gone to bed, he sat alone in the living room staring at the 3 young men smiling back at him. "Richard Whitmore, Alberto Delgado, Samuel Carter. Once they had stood side by side, believing the future belonged to all of them. Now one was a billionaire. One repaired old engines to make a living. And one had died believing he had failed his family. Jonathan reached for his phone. His finger hovered over his father's number. For years they had spoken only through silence. He almost put the phone down instead. He pressed call. The line rang 4 times. Finally, Richard answered. Neither man spoke. After nearly 10 seconds, Richard quietly asked, "Why are you calling?" Jonathan looked at the photograph. "I met with Alberto today." Silence. He showed me an old picture. Richard's breathing changed. Jonathan continued. "There was someone standing beside both of you, Samuel Carter." Another silence, longer this time. Jonathan finally asked the question that had been burning inside him. "Did you know him?" Richard closed his eyes. "I did." "What happened to him?" "I don't remember." Jonathan frowned. "You don't remember?" "No, you built a business together," I said. "I don't remember." Richard ended the call. Jonathan slowly lowered the phone. It wasn't his father's answer that disturbed him. It was the fear hidden inside it. Richard Whitmore had never sounded afraid before. Not once. The next morning, Richard canceled every meeting on his calendar. He locked himself inside his private office at Whitmore Industrial Holdings. For hours he stared through the glass walls overlooking the city. Charles Fenwick finally entered without speaking. "Been sitting here since sunrise." Richard nodded. Jonathan called. Charles immediately understood. "He knows about Samuel. Everything. He's getting closer." Charles walked toward the window. "I warned you this day would come." Richard gave a bitter smile. "I know. You should have told him the truth years ago." "I couldn't." "You wouldn't." Charles corrected him. Richard said nothing. His oldest friend was right. There had been countless opportunities. He had chosen silence every single time. Late that afternoon, Richard unlocked a hidden safe behind a bookshelf. Inside were dozens of neatly organized folders. Every one of them carried a date from nearly 30 years earlier: contracts, bank transfers, internal memos, handwritten notes, proof of everything. Richard carefully picked up a thick cream-colored envelope. Across the front, written in his own handwriting, were 6 simple words: "To my son. If I fail." His hands trembled. "I should have destroyed this years ago." Charles looked directly at him. "No, you should have given it to Jonathan." Richard slowly sat down. "I wanted to." "Then what stopped you?" Richard stared at the old photograph lying beside the envelope. "Every year it became harder. The longer I lied. The less I believed I deserved forgiveness." Charles spoke quietly. "Forgiveness isn't yours to decide. The truth is." Several minutes neither man spoke. Finally Richard sealed the envelope again. "If anything happens to me, promise me Jonathan receives this." Charles nodded. "You have my word." Richard leaned back in his chair for the first time in decades. He looked like a tired old man instead of one of the most powerful businessmen in America. He whispered almost to himself, "I've spent 30 years protecting my empire." A tear slowly rolled down his face. "And in doing so, I lost the only thing that ever truly mattered." Neither of them realized that fate had already made its decision. 3 weeks later, Richard Whitmore would never have another chance to tell his son the truth himself. 3 weeks later, Richard Whitmore was dead. The news spread across the country before noon. Every major television network interrupted its programming. Richard Whitmore, founder and chairman of Whitmore Industrial Holdings, has died at the age of 68 after suffering a sudden heart attack. Business leaders called him a visionary. Politicians praised his achievements. Financial experts spoke about the empire he had built. No one mentioned Samuel Carter. No one knew the truth. Jonathan learned of his father's death while unloading a delivery truck at work. His phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, then froze. For several seconds he couldn't move. Harold Bennett noticed immediately. "Jonathan." "What happened?" Jonathan slowly lowered the phone. "My father is gone." Harold placed a hand on his shoulder. "You should be with your family." Jonathan nodded. Without another word, he climbed into his car. The drive home felt endless. For 30 years he had imagined this day. He thought he would feel anger, relief, perhaps even satisfaction. Instead, there was only silence, a silence so heavy it was almost painful. When Jonathan walked through the front door, Maria looked at him once and understood. She crossed the room without asking a single question. She simply wrapped her arms around him. Jonathan rested his forehead against hers. "I kept believing." that someday we'd have one last conversation. Maria gently held his face. A son never truly stops waiting for his father. Jonathan closed his eyes. No, just learns to hide the hope. Days later, the funeral was held at St. Andrew's Cathedral. Hundreds of black cars lined the streets. Television crews waited outside. Some of the most powerful people in the country filled the church. Executives, politicians, judges, philanthropists, people Richard Whitmore had influenced throughout his career. Jonathan and Maria entered quietly through a side entrance. They sat in the last row. He never expected anyone to notice him. But Vanessa did. After the service ended, she walked slowly toward her younger brother. For a long moment they simply looked at each other. Neither knew how to begin. Finally, Vanessa whispered, "I've missed you." Jonathan's eyes filled with emotion. 30 years is a long time," she nodded. "Too long. I wanted to call you so many times." "What stopped you?" Vanessa looked toward their father's casket. "I was afraid." Jonathan gave a sad smile. "That seems to be the Whitmore family tradition." Vanessa lowered her head. "I'm sorry. I should have chosen my brother." Jonathan gently squeezed her hand. "It's over now." She shook her head. "No, I don't think it is." An hour later, she brought Jonathan and Maria back to the Whitmore estate. Nothing had changed. The marble floors still reflected every light. The paintings still covered the walls. The mansion still felt beautiful and empty. Vanessa led them into Richard's private study. She walked to his desk, unlocked the bottom drawer, and removed a thick cream-colored envelope sealed with dark red wax. Jonathan recognized his father's handwriting instantly. Across the front were 6 simple words: "To my son." "Read this alone." Vanessa carefully placed it into his hands. "He made Charles promise this would reach you." Jonathan looked at the envelope. His hands began to shake. "Did you read it?" She slowly shook her head. "No, made me swear I never would." "What did he tell you?" Vanessa swallowed. "He said, 'When you finish reading this, you'll finally understand why he destroyed our family.'" Room fell silent. Jonathan stared at the red wax seal. For 30 years he had searched for answers. Now they rested inside a single envelope. Maria gently touched his arm. "You don't have to do this today." Jonathan looked toward the empty chair where his father had spent thousands of evenings building an empire. While hiding the truth that had destroyed his own family, he took a slow breath, then carefully broke the seal. The first line stopped his heart. Asterisk asterisk, "My son. Everything I ever told you about Maria was a lie." Asterisk asterisk. Jonathan didn't realize how much time had passed. The world outside continued moving. Somewhere beyond the study window, reporters were still discussing Richard Whitmore's legacy. Inside the room, only silence remained. Maria sat beside him without speaking. She knew there were moments when words only made pain heavier. Jonathan unfolded the second page. His father's handwriting was less steady now. Every sentence looked as though it had been written by a man carrying a weight too heavy to bear. "My son, 30 years ago Whitmore Industrial Holdings stood on the edge of bankruptcy. The banks were preparing to seize everything. One final contract would decide whether my company survived or disappeared. That is the excuse I repeated to myself for decades." It was also the first lie. Jonathan continued reading. Richard confessed that Samuel Carter and Alberto Delgado had spent 2 years preparing the largest transportation proposal of their lives. They trusted him completely. They discussed business together. They believed he was their friend. Richard secretly paid one of their employees to reveal the exact amount of their confidential bid. Then he lowered Whitmore's offer by less than 1%, just enough to win, not because his company was better, not because he worked harder, because he stole what never belonged to him. Jonathan closed his eyes. His hands trembled. Maria quietly reached for his hand. He kept reading. "Newspapers called me brilliant. Investors called me a genius. Every award I accepted reminded me of the truth. Everything I built stood on a foundation of theft." Jonathan turned another page. Within months, Samuel Carter and Alberto Delgado lost everything. Their company collapsed. Employees lost their jobs. Banks took their equipment. Families were left with nothing. Then Jonathan reached the sentence that shattered him. 18 months later, Samuel Carter took his own life. The world believed he had failed. The truth is, I failed him. A tear landed on the paper. Jonathan wiped his eyes and continued. "I wanted to confess more times than I can count. I wrote letters. I hired lawyers. I even drove to Alberto's repair shop. Every single time I lost my courage, cowardice became easier than honesty. Jonathan slowly turned the next page. Then came the answer he had searched for since the day his father disowned him. The day you introduced Maria Delgado to our family. I recognized her immediately. She was Alberto's daughter. I knew that if you married her, our families would eventually become one. The truth I had buried would finally come to light. I wasn't afraid of Maria, I was afraid of justice, so instead of confessing, I sacrificed my own son. Jonathan lowered the pages. Everything finally made sense. His father had never hated Maria. He had hated the reminder of the man he used to be. Richard's final confession filled the last page. If you are reading this, I no longer deserve forgiveness. Forgiveness belongs to Alberto, to Emma Carter, to every family that suffered because of my choices. Inside this envelope you will find every document needed to prove my crimes: bank records, contracts, personal journals, signed statements. Give them to the authorities. Give them to Alberto. Find Samuel Carter's daughter. Tell her her father was an honorable man. Tell her he never betrayed his family. I betrayed all of you. Jonathan unfolded one final sheet. It wasn't a letter. It was a complete list of hidden bank accounts, properties, investments, and companies that had been built using money connected to the stolen contract. At the bottom, Richard had written one final sentence: "Return everything that never truly belonged to me." Jonathan carefully placed every page back into the envelope. He looked toward the empty chair where his father had spent decades protecting his empire. Then he quietly said, "My father spent 30 years hiding the truth." He looked at Maria. "Not going to spend one more day hiding it. Far away in Portland." Emma Carter had no idea that her entire life was about to change. Within days, someone would knock on her front door and tell her the truth: her father had been denied for nearly 30 years. 3 days later, Jonathan and Maria landed in Portland. The entire flight had passed in near silence. The envelope never left Jonathan's hands. Every time he looked at it, he remembered his father's final request: find Emma Carter, tell her the truth. Outside the airport, rain covered the streets with a gray mist. Maria looked at her husband. "You ready?" Jonathan gave a faint smile. "I don't think anyone could ever be ready for this." An hour later, they stopped in front of a modest white house at the end of a quiet street. Children's bicycles rested near the front porch. Flower pots lined the walkway. It looked like the kind of home built through years of sacrifice rather than fortune. Jonathan stood at the gate for several seconds. His heart pounded harder with every step. Finally, he knocked. Footsteps approached. The door opened. A woman in her early 40s stood before them. Her eyes carried the same quiet sadness Jonathan had seen in Samuel Carter's photograph. "Can I help you?" Jonathan swallowed. "Are you Emma Carter?" "I am. My name is Jonathan Whitmore." The smile disappeared from Emma's face. For several long seconds neither of them spoke. Finally she asked, "Whitmore?" Jonathan nodded. "Richard Whitmore was my father." Emma instinctively stepped backward. "If you're here because of another lawsuit." "I'm not." "You're here to protect his reputation." "I'm not." Folded her arms. "Then why are you standing on my porch?" Jonathan carefully removed the envelope from his bag. "Because my father spent 30 years lying to your family before he died." He finally told the truth. Emma stared at the envelope. "I don't want his money." Jonathan quietly shook his head. "I'm not offering money. I'm offering the truth." She looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of deception. Instead, she saw grief, the same grief she had carried since childhood. Slowly, she stepped aside. "Better come in." The living room was simple but warm. Family photographs covered the walls. Jonathan noticed one picture immediately. A smiling little girl sat on a man's shoulders. Samuel Carter. Emma followed Jonathan's gaze. "That's the last picture taken before he died." Her voice remained calm. "I was 12. Jonathan felt his throat tighten. Maria quietly reached for his hand beneath the table. Emma sat across from them. "So, what truth was worth flying across the country for?" Jonathan placed the envelope on the coffee table. "My father stole your father's future." Emma frowned. "Stole the contract. Bribed an employee. Won by using your father's confidential bid." Emma stared at him without blinking. "No." Jonathan slowly opened the envelope. Inside were contracts, bank records, signed confessions, personal journals. He placed the first page in front of her. Emma began reading. The room became completely silent. page after page. The color slowly disappeared from her face. Then she reached the sentence she had never imagined she would read. Asterisk Samuel Carter never failed his family. Asterisk asterisk I failed him. Asterisk Emma covered her mouth. Tears filled her eyes. For nearly 30 years, she had believed her father had given up because he wasn't strong enough. Now she learned he had been betrayed by the man the world admired. Her hands began to shake. I hated him, she whispered. Jonathan looked at her. I thought he abandoned us. Another tear rolled down her face. I spent my whole life believing my father wasn't strong enough to save us. She looked at the confession again. He didn't lose because he was weak. Lost because someone cheated. Jonathan quietly nodded. Yes. Emma closed the folder. For several seconds she couldn't speak. Then she looked directly at Jonathan. You came here knowing this would destroy your father's legacy. Jonathan answered without hesitation. My father's legacy was destroyed the day he chose the lie. I'm only making sure the truth survives. Emma broke down in tears. For the first time since she was 12 years old, she no longer blamed her father. Emma didn't leave the living room for nearly an hour. She read every page twice, every bank record, every signed statement, every line of Richard Whitmore's confession. When she finally looked up, her eyes were swollen from crying. My mother died believing my father destroyed our family. Her voice trembled. She defended him until the day she passed away. Emma closed her eyes. I wish she could have seen this. Jonathan quietly nodded. So do I. Emma stood and walked toward an old wooden cabinet. She opened the bottom drawer and carefully removed a faded cardboard box. Inside were dozens of letters, school drawings, birthday cards, a worn leather wallet. Finally, she unfolded a newspaper clipping. The headline read, asterisk asterisk local business owner found, stared at it. I was 12. Everyone talked about my father like he was a failure, said he couldn't handle losing his business. They said he gave up. She looked at Jonathan. No one ever asked what had really happened to him. Jonathan felt the weight of every word. I'm sorry. Emma slowly shook her head. You didn't do this. My father did. Jonathan answered quietly. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to repair what he destroyed. At that moment, two children ran into the living room, a boy around 10 years old, a little girl who couldn't have been older than 7. Mom, the little girl stopped when she saw strangers. Emma wiped away her tears and forced a smile. It's okay, she pulled them close. This is your grandfather. Children looked confused. Emma smiled sadly. Grandfather you never had the chance to meet. She picked up Samuel Carter's photograph. He loved people, worked harder than anyone I ever knew. And none of what happened was his fault. Children quietly looked at the photograph. Jonathan couldn't hold back his tears for the first time. Samuel Carter's grandchildren were hearing the truth about the man they had never known. Later that evening, Jonathan handed Emma the final folder. There is one more thing. She opened it. Inside was a complete list of Richard Whitmore's hidden accounts and assets connected to the stolen contract. Emma looked up in disbelief. What is this? My father's final instruction. Wanted every dollar connected to that crime returned. Emma slowly closed the folder. I don't want revenge. Jonathan nodded. Neither did he. He wanted justice. Maria finally spoke. What will you do? Emma looked through the window for a long time, then she quietly answered. I think. It's time the world learned who Samuel Carter really was. Weeks later, a press conference was held at Whitmore Industrial Holdings. Reporters expected another announcement about Richard Whitmore's estate. Instead, they watched Jonathan Whitmore, Vanessa Whitmore, Emma Carter, and Alberto Delgado walk onto the stage together. Hundreds of cameras flashed. No one in the audience understood why the four of them were standing side by side. Jonathan stepped to the microphone. He took a slow breath, then said the words that would shake the business world. My name is Jonathan Whitmore. Today, I'm here to tell you the truth about my father. The press conference was broadcast live across the country. Within minutes, every major news network switched to the story. No one had expected Jonathan Whitmore to appear. No one expected Emma Carter to stand beside him. And no one expected Vanessa Whitmore to take the seat next to Alberto Delgado. The room fell silent as Jonathan stepped to the microphone. My father built one of the largest companies in America. He paused. But the foundation of that success began with a crime. Gasps spread through the audience. Cameras flashed without stopping. Jonathan opened the folder. Nearly 30 years, Richard Whitmore hid evidence proving that he illegally obtained confidential bidding information from Samuel Carter and Alberto Delgado. He held up the documents. Today, every page of that evidence is being released to the public. Room exploded with questions. Richard Whitmore commit corporate fraud? Did the board know? Will there be criminal charges? Jonathan waited for the noise to settle. My father confessed everything before his death, accepted full responsibility, also left instructions that every asset connected to that crime be returned. Vanessa stepped forward, her voice trembled, as the new chairwoman of Whitmore Industrial Holdings. I accept my father's confession. I will not defend his actions. I will correct them. Room became completely silent again. No one had expected the Whitmore family to admit everything publicly. Emma slowly approached the microphone. She carried only one photograph. It was the same faded picture of Samuel Carter holding 12-year-old Emma on his shoulders. My father died believing the world thought he was a failure. She looked directly into the cameras. He wasn't. Was an honest man whose life was stolen. Tears filled the eyes of many reporters. Albert stood beside her. I spent 30 years blaming myself. He looked toward Jonathan. Today I finally know the truth. Following morning, every newspaper carried the same story. The Whitmore empire built on a 30-year secret public reaction was immediate. Investors demanded accountability. Former employees came forward with forgotten documents. Government investigators reopened the original contract. The company's stock price dropped sharply. Financial analysts predicted disaster instead. Vanessa made another announcement. Whitmore Industrial Holdings would create the Samuel Carter Foundation. Every dollar Richard had identified as connected to the stolen contract would be transferred into the foundation. The money would support struggling small business owners, provide scholarships for the children of entrepreneurs who had lost everything, and help families rebuild after financial hardship. Emma was invited to serve on the foundation's board. So was Alberto. Jonathan accepted only one role. Volunteer. When reporters asked why he refused a paid position, he smiled. My father spent his life proving how much money he could make. Rather spend mine proving what money should be used for. Months passed. Public opinion slowly changed. People no longer spoke only about Richard Whitmore's crime. They spoke about the courage it took for his own children to reveal it. One evening, Jonathan visited Samuel Carter's grave with Emma and Alberto. Fresh flowers rested beneath the headstone. Emma gently placed her hand on the stone. Dad. She smiled through tears. Truth finally found its way home. Jonathan stood quietly beside her for the first time in decades. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt peaceful. But one final chapter of Richard Whitmore's story still remained, a promise that Jonathan intended to keep. 1 year later, the Samuel Carter Foundation had helped hundreds of families rebuild their lives. Small businesses that had once faced bankruptcy received the support they needed. Students whose parents had lost everything were awarded scholarships. Communities that had never heard Samuel Carter's name now knew the story of the honest man whose dream had been stolen. Whitmore Industrial Holdings was no longer the same company Richard Whitmore had built. Under Vanessa's leadership, every major contract became publicly transparent. Independent ethics committees reviewed every important business decision. Employees were encouraged to report misconduct without fear. Trust returned slowly, not because people forgot the past, but because someone finally chose honesty over reputation. One warm spring afternoon, Jonathan stood outside a small church. Guests smiled as they gathered beneath white flowers. Soft music drifted through the open doors. Today wasn't about business. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about the past. It was Isabel's wedding day. Jonathan adjusted his suit and watched his daughter step out of the car. She looked exactly as Maria had looked on their wedding day many years earlier. For a moment he couldn't speak. Isabel laughed. "What is it?" Jonathan smiled through tears. "I was just wondering when my little girl grew up." She wrapped her arms around him. "I'll always be your little girl." Inside the church, every seat was filled. Family, friends, neighbors. Harold Bennett, Alberto Delgado, Emma Carter, and her children. Vanessa sat quietly beside Alina. Years earlier, none of them could have imagined sharing the same room. Love had done what pride never could, it had brought them together. As Jonathan walked Isabel down the aisle, she suddenly slowed. She looked toward the front row. Dad. Jonathan followed her eyes. One chair remained empty. A single white rose rested on the seat. There wasn't supposed to be an empty chair. Jonathan smiled gently. There was. Isabel looked at him. Who is it for? Jonathan took a slow breath. Grandfather. The one who wished he had found the courage to come home long before he died. Isabel quietly nodded. Then she reached down, picked up the white rose, and carried it with her as Jonathan walked her the rest of the way down the aisle, not as a symbol of forgiveness, not as a symbol of forgetting, but as a reminder that truth always arrives, even when it comes too late. After the ceremony, everyone gathered outside beneath the afternoon sun. Children laughed across the garden. Music filled the air. Emma walked over to Jonathan. You know, for years I thought justice meant watching someone suffer. She smiled. I was wrong. Jonathan looked at her. What does it mean now? Emma glanced toward her children playing with Isabel and Miguel. It means making sure they inherit something better than we did. Jonathan nodded. I think my father would have understood that. Eventually. As the sun began to set, Jonathan walked alone to the edge of the garden. He looked toward the sky. There was no anger left, only peace. His father had left him an empire built on a lie. Jonathan had chosen to leave his own children something far more valuable, a family built on truth. Years later, when people spoke about Richard Whitmore, they no longer remembered only the billionaire who lost everything because of one terrible decision. They also remembered the son who refused to protect a lie, the daughter who chose integrity over wealth, a family that returned what had never belonged to them, and the ordinary people who proved that character is worth more than any fortune, because wealth can build companies, power can build empires, but only truth can rebuild a family.